Order. Questions to the Secretary of State for Scotland. Martin Day.
Yes. Number 1.
The Secretary of State for Scotland, Secretary David Mundell.
Mr. Speaker, this has been a momentous week for Andy Murray. So I'm sure you will agree that it's appropriate at this Scottish Questions that we acknowledge in this House Andy's extraordinary contribution to British sport and his personal resilience and courage. And I express our hope that we will once again see Andy Murray on court. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 1, 4, 7, 8, 10, 12 and 14 together. I am in regular contact with the Home Secretary on a range of issues of importance to Scotland, including future immigration policy after the UK leaves the European Union.
Apart from his enormous talent, can I agree with the Secretary of State more widely about Andy Murray? He is the embodiment of guts and character and the most terrific ambassador for Scotland, for tennis and for sport. His mother Judy must be the proudest mother in the world. Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Tories' obsession with slashing immigration to the tens of thousands will see Scotland's working-age population decline by 4.5%. That's 150,000 people by 2041. Is the Secretary of State happy standing over such a policy that will cause economic harm to our country?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman does not correctly characterise the situation. The immigration white paper which this government has set out is an undertaking to embark on a year-long engagement process across the whole of the UK to enable businesses and other stakeholders to shape the final details of a post-Brexit immigration policy and process.
Neil Gray.
I concur with your comments and the Secretary of State's regarding Andy Murray, and I would encourage all members to sign my EDM recognising his achievements. Immigration has been and continues to be good for Scotland, and Scottish Government modelling suggests the Brexit-driven reduction in migration will see real GDP drop 6.2% by 2040, which has a monetary value of about £6.8 billion and a £2 billion cost to the government revenue. Does the Secretary of State believe that this cost to Scotland is a price worth paying for his government's Brexit mess and immigration folly?
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to end up repeating my first answer on 7 occasions, but I want to make clear that the immigration white paper which we have published is a consultation. It's an undertaking of a year-long engagement process across the whole of the UK, including Scotland, and I expect Scottish businesses, Scottish stakeholders and indeed the Scottish Government to play an active part in that process.
Dr Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Scrapping freedom of movement will make recruiting staff for NHS Scotland harder. And despite being paid the real living wage, lab technicians, admin staff and social care workers don't earn anywhere close to £30,000. So what did he do to try and convince the Home Secretary to take into account Scotland's needs?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to take any lectures from the honourable lady on Scotland's needs in relation to the NHS from an SNP that has put up tax in Scotland so that doctors and nurses in Scotland pay more tax than anywhere else in the UK.
Speaker, I was interested to hear the Secretary of State's comments about Scottish businesses. CBI Scotland said that the proposals outlined in the White Paper don't meet Scotland's needs and were a sucker punch. Isn't it the case that this hostile immigration policy proves the Tory government is anti-business?
Mr. Speaker, I'm really pleased to hear the honourable lady supporting the CBI, because the CBI couldn't have been clearer. They don't want a separate Scottish immigration policy. They want one immigration policy for the whole of the United Kingdom, and I agree with them on that.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, this is absolutely pathetic. When we look at Greenfield Park Care Home in my constituents, we have an ageing population. We need people to come and look after the folk that live in Greenfield Park Care Home, and the Secretary of State is absolutely out of touch with this. Not only get a grip and understand Scotland's immigration needs are entirely different from this London-centric policy pursued by this British government.
Mr. Speaker, I understand very well the issues that face Scotland. I don't believe that they would be better served by having a separate immigration policy in Scotland, and I don't believe that immigration into Scotland is well served by a Scottish Government who puts up tax, has a poor record on infrastructure and housing.
Marion Fellows.
Mr. Speaker, the policy chair for the Scottish Federation of Small Businesses has said the UK Government's obstinate approach to immigration is a clear threat to local communities, making it nigh impossible for the vast majority of Scottish firms to get the labouring skills they need to grow and sustain their businesses. What part of that comprehensive statement would the Secretary of State care to disagree with?
I've set out in my previous answers that the immigration white paper is a consultation, and the FSB and others are contributing to that, and we will listen to it. I am clear that Scotland benefits from a UK-wide immigration policy, but I also believe that there are things that the Scottish Government could do to make Scotland more attractive for people to come to.
Drew Hendry.
Mr. Speaker, following the disgraceful Christmas video aimed at EU nationals and then the catastrophic defeat for his government last night, will he now urge his government to end the hostile approach to our EU friends, neighbours and colleagues, vital to the Scottish economy and communities?
I agree that EU nationals have played an enormous part in the Scottish economy and more widely in civic society, and I wanted to give them certainty last night in relation to what their position would be, and that's why I voted for the deal.
Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Is the Secretary of State aware that on the 10th of January this year, the Times reported a study conducted by one of Britain's leading social surveys which shows that Scots do not want immigration to be devolved? Does he agree that that is a hammer blow to the cause of the SNP, and that the biggest danger to Scotland is their drive for another independence referendum which puts people off wanting to come to Scotland?
Mr. Speaker, it's certainly clear that the SNP does something to put off people coming to Scotland. Last night I read that Boy George was going to be moving to Scotland. This morning the First Minister of Scotland engaged with him, and now we hear he's not coming.
David Duquette.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm that the Home Office and the Government in general will continue to engage, and have been engaging, but will continue to engage with Scottish businesses in consultation of the immigration bill?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to engage. The White Paper is an engagement process, and I know that my honourable friend, as the great champion of the fishing industry that he is, has already brought forward issues in relation not just to fishing vessels but to fish processing.
Luke Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome this government's move to guarantee EU citizens' rights here in the United Kingdom. Unlike the SNP in 2014, who threatened EU citizens that 160,000 would be stripped of their right to remain in Scotland. No unilateral guarantee was given to EU citizens by the SNP in 2014, but it is by this government. So can my honourable friend clarify the direct communication this government is having with EU citizens in my constituency and elsewhere in Scotland to make sure they are welcome and valued part of our community?
Mr. Speaker, the government is engaged in a process of not just engaging with EU citizens, but setting out very clearly for them how they can proceed in the process of settled status.
John Stevenson.
Mr. Speaker, the Borderlands area on both sides of the border needs to attract more people to come and live and work in that area. Would the Minister agree with me that the way to do that is through investment, both private and public, and create the business environment for that investment, not by increasing taxes and regulation?
Mr. Speaker, I absolutely agree with my colleague, and as he knows, this government fully supports the Borderlands initiative. It is investment, it is improving infrastructure and housing that will bring about making the south of Scotland, north of England more attractive, not putting up taxes.
Colin Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
tax divergence by the Scottish Government is damaging my Gordon constituency, struggling to attract overseas workers to Aberdeen Royal Infirmary and the oil and gas industry. Would the Secretary of State agree this is economic madness which makes Scotland unattractive?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times before in this chamber, I remain at an absolute loss to understand why the SNP think making Scotland the most highly taxed part of the United Kingdom is an attractive proposition to bring people to Scotland.
Stephen Kerr.
Mr. Speaker, can I, as the Member of Parliament for Dunblane, add my admiration for Sir Andy Murray and indeed for his mother? On the issue of the White Paper on future immigration, does my right honourable friend agree that the salary floor of £30,000 makes it difficult for Scotland to retain international graduates when the average graduate salary is £21,000? There has to be the opposite of London waiting, doesn't there?
I think my honourable friend makes a very good point, and I'm sure that that's one that will be taken very much into account as we move forward the engagement process with the White Paper.
Outing at the top of your list. Paul Sweeney.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State's government have been responsible for pursuing an agenda where immigrants are demonised. We saw over the last year with the hostile environment policy. We saw over the Christmas break when the Home Secretary declared a national crisis when a handful of refugees made the perilous journey across the Channel, and we now see it in black and white in the form of the Immigration White Paper. So my question is simple. Will the Secretary of State apologise for his government's demonisation of immigrants and its harmful consequences for the Scottish economy?
Mr. Speaker, of course I don't accept the honourable gentleman's characterisation of events. Scotland remains a place which should be welcome for migrants wherever they come from. The White Paper sets out a basis for a consultation for developing a new immigration policy post-Brexit, and I encourage everyone to take part in that consultation.
Gilbert Hopkins.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministry of Defence spent nearly £1.6 billion with Scottish businesses in 2016-17, supporting some 10,500 jobs. I think that this really does demonstrate the vital contribution of the workforce in Scotland to defending the UK from the growing threats that we face from across the globe.
Gilbert Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At Defence Questions on 26th of November, I raised concerns about the desperate shortage of Royal Navy coastal defence vessels, numbering just 3 to the Minister, according to the Minister. It is also the case that Scottish shipyards have suffered from major cuts in defence orders. Will the Government now right both these wrongs by allocating new orders for coastal defence vessels from Scottish shipbuilders? Hear, hear.
I'm afraid I don't agree with the honourable gentleman. We have secured 20 years' worth of work on the Clyde with the shipyards there. I think we would be hard-pressed to find any industry in the UK that could say that they've secured 20 years' worth of work that helps their workforce for the future.
Kirsten Hare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Armed Forces personnel in my constituency of Angus and across Scotland warmly welcomed the UK Government's intervention last year to mitigate the Scottish Government's income tax increase. Can my honourable friend confirm that in fact the UK Government will seek to continue this mitigation to ensure our Armed Forces personnel are not out of pocket in Scotland?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this very important issue, and the Ministry of Defence is reviewing the Scottish Government's plans for next year's tax. We await the final outcome and ratification from the Scottish Parliament. We will review the situation and determine whether the impact on the UK Armed Forces warrants an offer of financial mitigation, and once a decision has been made, an announcement will be made to this House and to those personnel affected.
Happy birthday, Mr. Sweeney. I gather it's a significant birthday. 30 today. Don't look a day older than 20. Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The defence sector is critical for the Scottish economy, but so are other sectors like financial services, higher education, food and drink, and indeed fisheries. So would the Minister have a chat with the Secretary of State to make sure in Cabinet the Secretary of State is insisting that a no deal is ruled out?
I think I do admire the honourable gentleman's ingenious way of bringing in issues around defence industry in this way, but I would say that my right honourable friend is constantly fighting for Scotland around the Cabinet table, and he will continue to do so long into the future.
Chris Stevens.
Shipbuilding tradition of long may that continue, but there is key work being key contracts for the land platform, which the Minister is aware of. Can he tell us what he's doing to make sure Scotland gets a good share of those land platform contracts?
Well, as I said earlier, in terms of the Ministry of Defence, we are trying to build in a good shipbuilding programme so that actually shipyards around the country know what the MOD's requirements are going to be for the next 30 years so that they can plan accordingly. But we also want them to be incredibly competitive so that they're able to compete for competition, for commercial lines, not just in this country, but for opportunities that exist around the world.
What would the impact be of the break-up of the Union on defence supply companies based in Scotland?
Catastrophic.
Leslie Laird.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would just like to start by adding my sentiments to those expressed by the Secretary of State on our wonderful sportsman, Andy Murray. Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State has turned his back on Scotland's great shipbuilding tradition by putting the Fleet Solid Support contract out to international tender. The Secretary of State will no doubt trot out the line that these are not warships. However, the Minister of State for Defence, Mundell, responded to a written question saying they were non-complex warships. Well, I grew up in a shipbuilding community. A warship carried weapons, explosives and ammunition, which is exactly what these ships do. So, if these are not warships, what are they?
Well, I've made this point consistently, and the Honourable Lady will know that the National Shipbuilding Strategy defines warships as frigates, destroyers and aircraft carriers. The primary role of the FSS ships is the replenishment of naval vessels with bulk stores. They are not combatant naval auxiliary support ships, and therefore they will go out to international competition. But what I'm delighted to see is that there is a British bid for that competition.
Leslie Laird.
Well, can I suggest to the Secretary of State that he might want to go and visit a shipyard, as I'm sure there's plenty of workers there that would like to give him a different account of that strategy. These are high-skilled, high-paid jobs that could return £2.3 billion of revenue to the Treasury, while providing sustainable employment and ensuring that communities continue to thrive. Instead, the Secretary of State is torpedoing Scottish shipbuilding in favour of bargain basement deals. So, will he allow this Prime Minister to continue the destructive legacy of Thatcher, or will he support the Scottish Labour Party and the Labour Party and back our plans to finally stand up for the Scottish shipbuilding and to protect and create jobs in the industry?
Well, it may have escaped the Honourable Lady's attention that I'm not the Secretary of State, and I have visited many of the shipyards around this country and in Scotland, and I've seen for myself how good they are doing. And what we want is them to be competitive so that they can have a long-term future. We've got 20 years of work guaranteed for Scotland's shipyards. I think that's something that we can be proud of on this side of the House.
Mr Speaker, listen to me. Minister Andrew.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We have been making good progress since the Government's intention to negotiate a Murray deal, which was announced in September last year. The partners there have submitted a number of project proposals which are currently being scrutinised.
Douglas Ross. Grateful to the Minister for that response. The MOD are one of the largest employers in Murray and set to get even bigger with the significant UK Government investment. Given that local personnel at Kinloss Barracks and RAF Lossiemouth are already engaged with the Murray Growth Deal, will the Minister confirm that his department will now play a significant role in this very important deal for Murray?
Well, first of all, I'd like to pay tribute to my humble friend for the work that he's doing with this deal. I know that he takes a very keen interest in it, and so does the Ministry of Defence. In terms of surplus land being released at Forsyth as part of the Sterling deal, and he is right that as a local employer we are an important player in that area, and I can confirm that the Ministry of Defence is exploring opportunities for involvement in his local growth deal.
Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, I meet regularly with the Scottish Government in a number of forums to discuss a range of matters related to EU exit. The JMC plenary met on the 19th of December and was attended by the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales, along with the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service.
Steve Blackman.
Will he encourage the Prime Minister to extend Article 50?
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has set out quite clearly that it is not her intention to request an extension of Article 50.
Pete Wishart.
Scotland wanted nothing to do with this ugly, self-defeating Brexit. But last night, 10 Scottish Tories voted to defy their constituents, with the other 3 wanting something much, much worse for Scotland. What should the Scottish people therefore do to ensure that they're suitably democratically rewarded?
Mr. Speaker, we're not taking lectures from a man who repeatedly defies the democratic will of the Scottish people by ignoring the outcome of the 2014 independence referendum.
Swinson.
Mr. Speaker, while we were in different lobbies last night, I appreciate that the Secretary of State genuinely felt that the Prime Minister's deal was the best way forward. But he can read the runes of how likely it is that that deal or any reincarnation of it will get through this House. So what personal commitment will he give that he will do everything in his power to protect Scotland from the catastrophe of a no-deal exit, including putting his country above his party and his own position?
Mr. Speaker, I've been very clear on the ramifications for Scotland of a no-deal Brexit and why I wanted to avoid that, and that's why I voted for the deal. But I'm also clear on the position I stood in the 2017 general election on a manifesto of delivering an orderly Brexit for Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom, and that's what I intend to do.
Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I begin by associating these benches with the comments that you and the Secretary of State have made regarding Andy Murray. He is indeed a great ambassador for his country, and I believe in that capacity his best is yet to come. Mr. Speaker, last night this place made history. We defeated the government's plans by an unprecedented majority. These are plans on which the Secretary of State has staked his reputation and on which his fingerprints are indelibly printed. Given that massive defeat, will he now commit to meaningful engagement with the Scottish Government and consideration of alternative plans, including remaining in the single market and the customs union?
Mr. Speaker, I make no apology for supporting the Prime Minister's deal. I believe that it was the right deal for Scotland and the United Kingdom. And of course we will engage constructively with the First Minister and the Scottish Government. But if we are to do so, then they must bring forward proposals other than stopping Brexit and starting another independence referendum.
Shepherd.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was going to suggest that the Secretary of State is ill-equipped
to take this process forward in Scotland, but he makes the argument for me. Given his refusal to engage properly in discussion about alternatives, given the fact he is so out of step with opinion in Scotland at every level, will he now do the decent thing and resign, step aside, so that someone else can take this forward?
Mr. Speaker, that's getting a little tired. I thought the honourable gentleman could think of another sound bite. I'm not out of step with opinion in Scotland. People in Scotland do not want another independence referendum, and they recognise that the SNP has weaponised Brexit in order to try and deliver such a referendum.
Ian Foster.
Question number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, leaving the common fisheries policy will allow the UK to take back control of our waters, becoming an independent coastal state. We will negotiate a fairer share of fishing opportunities to benefit fishermen in Scotland and across the whole of the United Kingdom.
I thank my right honourable friend for the positive assessment he's just given the prospects, not just for Scotland's fishing industry, but for the whole of the UK from leaving the EU's common fisheries policy. Yet would he agree those benefits would be lost if we listen to the arguments of those who want to separate our union but reunite Scotland with the European Union's common fisheries policy?
Indeed, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The SNP are false friends to Scottish fishermen. They want to keep Scotland in the CFP by staying in the EU, and failing that, they want an independent Scotland to rejoin the CFP. Throughout the negotiations, this government has shown that it has put the interests of Scottish fishermen and those across the UK at the heart of our approach to leaving the EU.
Martin Whitfield.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Would no deal not be a disaster for the fishing industry and its support industries, and shouldn't we say no to no deal now?
Mr. Speaker, if that's the honourable gentleman's view, then he should have voted for the Prime Minister's deal last night.
Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the government's commitment to ending the CFP on the 31st of December of next year is sincere, why does the government continue to resist amendments to put that date on the face of the Fisheries Bill?
I don't think that my right honourable former colleague will find that that is an accurate interpretation of the government's positions, and my colleagues, like the honourable gentleman for Banff and Buchan, has argued strongly for that case, and we will see what happens when the